The alarm on my wrist scanner had been going off for 4 seconds before anyone else on the landing platform even flinched. I was standing at the rear ramp of Transport 7, checking the magnetic seals on the cargo clamps for the third time that morning. When the low pulse started for seconds, that is a long time when your instincts are telling you that something is wrong. I clicked it off, scanned the canyon ridge line to the north and saw nothing. Clear sky, orange dust drifting on a slow wind, the kind of quiet that feels like it is holding its breath. Recruit Calloway, the voice came from behind me. Smooth, slightly too formal, with the clipped vowels of someone who had learned Standard as a second language and had never quite let go of the habit of treating every sentence like a small contract. I turned around. She was already looking past me. Elindra's son, third daughter of the chorus throne, was taller than I had expected. The briefing files had described her as slender, but that word did not cover it. She moved the way a person moves when they have never once worried about whether there is enough space for them in a room. She wore a long coat the color of deep water, and her aide, a short blue-skinned Catholic named Orvis, was walking 2 steps behind her with a data tablet pressed against his chest. She looked at the transport. She looked at the assembled security unit. Her eyes moved across the line of us the way a general reviews a map, not looking at any individual thing, just reading the shape of the whole picture. Then her eyes landed on me. She held them there for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said very quietly to Orvis, "Why is there a primate on the security detail?" Orvis checked his tablet. "He is with the Coalition Frontier Unit, my lady. Recruit class, provisional clearance. Assigned to rear position. A recruit," she said, not a question, more like she was confirming a fact that mildly disappointed her, the way you might confirm that, yes, the hotel had run out of your preferred tea. She moved on. She did not look at me again. I turned back to the canyon ridge line and watched it. For another few seconds, the scanner had gone quiet. Nothing out there, probably a rock bird triggering the motion sensor. I checked the cargo clamps a 4th time. "My name is Calloway, Owen Calloway. I grew up in a coastal town in the north of England where it rained approximately 9 months out of every 12, and where the main local industry had been at various points in history fishing, shipbuilding, and eventually the manufacturing of components for deep space antenna arrays. I was 26 years old. I had been in the Coalition Frontier Unit for 11 months, which made me officially the least experienced person on this security assignment by margin. So large it was almost funny. Humans had been in the Galactic Coalition for just over a century. We had arrived loud, enthusiastic, and deeply confused, the way any young species does when it first realizes that the universe is not only full of other minds but has been full of them for a very long time, and nobody had thought to send us a message. We were given observer status, then associate membership, then after a few decades of proving we were generally not going to cause catastrophic diplomatic incidents, we were offered full membership and the right to contribute personnel to coalition operations. The problem, as every human in a coalition uniform quickly discovered, was that full membership did not automatically come with full respect. The Cathalia had been spacefaring for 400 years. The Sun Chorus, the princess's people, have been navigating between stars for over 6 centuries. the Verith Dominion, who are the reason this convoy existed at all, have been the dominant military force in this sector of the galaxy for 300 years without ever being seriously challenged. Humans were, by comparison, an interesting footnote. We were known as good engineers, decent pilots, surprisingly capable diplomats. When we bothered to be patient, we were also known for being physically unremarkable. No natural armor, no psionic ability, no specialized sensory organs, no regenerative biology. We were soft-bodied, medium-sized, and moderately quick compared to the species that had been sharpening themselves against a dangerous universe for centuries. We looked like something the galaxy had not quite gotten around to finishing. I had heard some version of the primate on the security detail comment before. Not always that elegant, but always that category of thought. You get used to it. You smile, you nod, and you go check the cargo clamps a fifth time. Sergeant Vale, a Catherly, brought across the shoulders with the kind of calm that comes from having survived 15 years of coalition operations, appeared to my elbow. You heard her, he said. I heard her. I said, don't take it personally. I don't, I said, and I meant it, not because I had thick skin, but because I had something more useful than thick skin out here. I paid attention, and at that moment my attention was on the ridge line and the way the dust on it was settling in a pattern that did not quite match the wind direction. They'll follow my gaze. What are you looking at? Probably nothing, I said, but I want to move the princess to transport 3 before we depart. It's the middle vehicle, harder targeting angle. Vic was quiet for a moment, then he said, I'll mention it to Orvis. The suggestion was rejected politely by Orvis, who explained that the princess's accommodations had been arranged specifically aboard Transport 7, and that rearranging them would require a formal request submitted through the Coalition Logistics Office on Verith Station, which would take between 4 and 7 standard days. We departed in transport 740 minutes later. I sat at the rear ramp with my scanner in my lap and watched the canyon walls rise on either side of us as the convoy moved into the Kelmehirn Pass. The walls were old red rock carved by water that had not been there for thousands of years. The canyon was narrow enough that the transports had to move in single file wingtip clearance measured in meters. I had read about this route in the briefing files. It was rated as low risk. The breath had not been confirmed in this sector for 11 weeks. I kept watching the ridge line. Anyway, the princess walked past me, once heading toward the forward observation deck. She glanced at me the way you glance at a piece of furniture that is slightly in the way, and she was gone. I adjusted my grip on the scanner and turned back to the canyon walls. 40 minutes into the transit, the scanner lit up like a festival, and the world changed. The pulse hit the convoy like a wave rolling through water. I felt it in my chest first, not a sound, not a physical pressure, but something deeper, something that reached into the oldest part of my brain and pulled on a wire that had been there since before my species had words for what it was. Feeling fear, the specific ancient kind, the kind that does not come from thinking, it comes from knowing, the way an animal knows when something larger is watching it from the dark. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Every other person on Transport 7 stopped moving at the same moment. Sergeant Vale, who had been running a systems Check at the forward panel, went. Completely still, one hand on the console, his head slightly lowered like a large animal that has suddenly understood it is being hunted. The two Sun soldiers assigned to the corridor froze mid-step. Orvis somewhere behind me in the cabin made a sound that was not quite a word. The second thing I noticed was that the transport's engines had gone quiet, not off. The emergency lights were still cycling, but the main drive had cut. Whatever the pulse was, it had reached the electronics too. And the third thing I noticed was that I was moving. I did not decide to move. My legs made the decision before my brain caught up. I was already crossing the cabin floor at a low run before the logical part of my mind had finished processing the words breath psionic dampener. I had read about them in the tactical files, never experienced one. The files had said in the careful, neutral language that military documents use when they're describing something genuinely terrible, that the dampener generates a targeted fear response signal calibrated to the neural architecture of most known sentient species. The effect varies. In Catholi, it produces near total motor suspension. In Sun chorus members, it creates a dissociative state that can last up to 6 minutes. In several other species, the response is even more severe. In humans, the files had noted effects are inconsistent and not yet fully documented. I could tell them what the effect was. It felt like running toward a house fire. Your body is screaming at you that this is wrong, that you're going the wrong direction, that every nerve in your skin is telling you to stop, but your hands are still in front of you and your feet are still moving. And some stubborn, unreasonable part of you has decided that stopping is simply not an option right now. I grabbed the princess by the arm. She was standing in the doorway of the forward observation deck, completely still, her eyes wide and fixed on something that was not in the room. The dampener had her. I did not wait for her to pass. I pulled her sideways hard, putting my body between her and the forward viewport, and got us both behind the overturned cargo frame. Near the port wall, a solid block of pressed composite about 1.5 meters high, bolted to the floor and heavy enough to stop a standard pulse round. She came back to herself in pieces. First her breathing changed, then her hand stopped being limp and found the edge of the cargo frame and gripped it. Then she looked at me. What? She started. I pressed my sidearm into her hands. It was a standard coalition short barrel, 7 rounds, simple trigger mechanism. Any species with fingers could operate it. Point at the door, I said. Anything that comes through that isn't me, you pull the trigger. You don't think about it, you just do it. She looked at the weapon. She looked at me. She was a princess of the chorus throne. She had probably never held a weapon in her life. She took it in both hands, turned toward the door, and held it steady. I had 1 second of genuine surprise, then I was gone. The rear ramp of Transport 7 was partially open. The magnetic seals had failed with the drive cut out, and I went through the gap low and fast, dropping onto the canyon floor and rolling into the shadow of the transport's undercarriage. The air outside smelled like hot rock and something else, something faintly metallic, which meant the breath were already close. They have a specific smell. I had read that too. I had not believed it until that moment. I pressed my back against the undercarriage and looked down the length of the canyon, 200 m away, for shapes were moving through the dust, large, low to the ground, they moved with the unhurried, absolute confidence of things that had never needed to hurry. Breath warriors. Scout class from a size slightly smaller than the full combat variant, built for speed and infiltration rather than direct assault. They wore no visible armor. They did not need it. Their natural exoskeleton was rated to withstand standard pulse rounds at most engagement distances. They moved in perfect synchronization, each one exactly mirroring the spacing and pace of the others because they were sharing a single tactical mind at that moment. The psionic link that made a breath squad function like one organism. 4 of them moving toward the convoy. Unhurried, certain. I looked at my sidearm, 7 rounds. I looked at my equipment belt, 1 flash canister, 1 emergency med pack, a length of restraint cable, a field tool kit, and half a ration bar I had not finished at breakfast. I looked back at the 4 shapes moving through the dust. Then I looked at the canyon walls, at the shadows, at the geometry of the space. I looked at the exposed fuel line running along the underside of Transport 620M. To my left, I looked at the pile of loose cargo containers that had spilled from Transport 4's rear hatch when the engines cut. I looked at the angle of the sun and the length of the shadows it was throwing. Then I started moving. Not toward the breath, not away from them. Sideways into the shadows, into the geometry of the canyon that they had not yet learned the way I was learning it. Right now, the first thing I did was the fuel line. I did not ignite it. That would have destroyed 2 transports and achieved nothing useful. Instead, I cracked the seal at the coupling joint and let it run. The fluid spread quickly across the canyon floor, thin and nearly invisible, covering about an 8 m stretch between 2 cargo containers. Then I moved to the containers themselves. They were standard coalition freight boxes, half a meter square, made of press composite. Individually they weighed about 30 kilos, stacked against each other at the right angle with the right amount of pressure applied at the base. They would do something interesting. I set 4 of them in a precise arrangement. Then I moved back into the shadow of Transport 7 and waited. Lead breath scout reached the edge of the fuel spill in 40 seconds. It stopped, tilted its head, a very slight movement, almost imperceptible, and I knew it had detected the fluid. They had excellent chemical sensory organs. It had noticed something was wrong. That was exactly what I needed. When a breath scout detects an anomaly, it does not proceed independently. It pauses and shares the data with the rest of the group through the psionic link, and the group evaluates together before they move. It is an extraordinarily efficient system. It is also extraordinarily predictable. All 4 scouts stop at the same moment. All 4 of them were looking at the same thing: the fuel spill, the cargo containers, the seemingly empty stretch of canyon between them and the transports. None of them were looking up. I had climbed a side of Transport 6 during their pause. The whole plating had enough grip points for a careful ascent, and I was at the roof line in under 20 seconds. From up there I had a clear angle on the rear of the scout formation. I used 3 of my 7 rounds, 3 separate targets, 3 very specific shots, not center mass where the exoskeleton was thickest, but at the joint where the neck meets the upper shoulder plate, where the armor is thinner because it has to allow for movement. I had read about that too in the weapons section of The tactical files that most people skip, because they assume they would never be in a position to use the information. 3 scouts went down, not eliminated. Breath are nearly impossible to take out cleanly with a sidearm, but incapacitated, disoriented, cut off from the psionic link. The 4th scout spun, tore me the instant the link broke. It moved fast, much faster than anything that size had any right to move. It covered 15 m in what felt like 2 seconds, and I was already off the transport roof and running before I consciously registered that I had made the decision to jump. I landed badly. My left ankle took the impact wrong and sent a spike of pain up my leg that I noted and filed away for later. I kept running. The 4th scout followed. I led it directly into the cargo containers. The arrangement I had built was simple for boxes stacked at an angle, balanced against each other with enough tension that the impact of something running into them from one direction would cause them to collapse inward toward the other side. The scout hit the stack at full speed because it was watching me, not where it was going. 300 kilos of composite freight came down across its back and legs. The scout was not hurt. Nothing that simple was in a hurt of breath, but it was pinned, and pinned was enough. I used the restraint cable on its wrists while it was still working out how to lift the weight. Then I dragged it back toward Transport 7 by the cable, moving backward, watching the canyon around me, breathing hard through my nose because my mouth tasted like iron, and I did not want to think too carefully about why. When I reached the rear ramp, I hauled the scout up the steps, secure the cable to a cargo anchor point on the interior wall, and turn around. The princess was still behind the cargo frame, still holding the sidearm in both hands, still pointing it at the door. She was staring at the breath scout I had just dragged through it. Then she looked at me, really looked at me for the first time since she had stepped onto the landing platform that morning. I was dirty. My left ankle was complaining. I had lost my jacket somewhere between the fuel spill and the cargo containers, and I was breathing like I had run a race. I need you to keep holding that, I told her, nodding at the sidearm. She swallowed. Are there more? Yes, I said, but the main force is still an hour out. Right now, I need to know how many of your soldiers are operational. She was already thinking, already calculating. She turned toward the corridor. Orvis, she called, and her voice was steady. That surprised me too. I went back to the rear ramp and stood at the edge, looking out at the canyon. 3 scouts down in the dust, 1 secure in the cabin, the convoy sitting silent in the pass. 45 minutes until the main force arrived. I pulled out my scanner and started counting heat signatures. Inside the cabin, I could hear the princess giving clear, quick instructions to Orvis about what to check and who to wake. She was not panicking. She was not frozen. She had looked at the situation, made some kind of internal decision, and gotten to work. I filed that way too. Then I turned back to the canyon and started making a plan. The scanner showed 12 heat signatures moving through the canyon from the northern approach. 12 was not a scout unit. 12 was a full breath combat squad, the kind sent to resolve situations, not investigate them. I looked at the time. I looked at the canyon walls. I looked at the 6 half-functional soldiers beginning to shake off the dampener's effect inside the transports around me. Then I started walking because there was a very specific piece of the canyon I needed to Look at more carefully, and I only had about 40 minutes to turn it into something useful. Behind me through the open ramp, I could hear the princess still talking, organizing, adapting. I walked faster, one of the returning sensations as the psionic dampener effects faded was embarrassment. I recognized it clearly in the faces of the soldiers around me as they came back to themselves and realized what had happened, that they had been stopped cold, standing still in the middle of a combat situation by a wave of engineered fear for species with long warrior traditions. It was a humiliation for Sergeant Vale especially, who had fought in 3 major coalition engagements and never once broken under fire. The expression on his face when he found me inside Transport 7 was one I had never seen on him before. It was something close to shame. How long was I down? He asked. About 8 minutes, I said. He looked at the secured breath scout on the wall and said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at me and I watched him push the shame aside and replace it with something more practical: attention. What do you need? He said. That was when things started to move. I spread the scanner display across the cargo frame top and walked Vale through what I had seen in the canyon. He was sharp, even with the lingering after effects of the dampener, asking clean, precise questions, absorbing the information fast. The other soldiers who were recovering gathered around. There were 6 of us, functional or close to it, 2 Sun soldiers, 2 Cathali including Vale, 1 Terra medic named Das who had the advantage of a different neural structure that made the dampeners effect on her much shorter, and me. 6 people in a canyon against 12 Reth combat soldiers. I had done the math several times. I kept arriving at the same conclusion: we should not survive this engagement. 12 Reth combat soldiers, coordinated by a psionic link, each one armored and fast and trained in a fighting tradition that went back centuries, was not a force that 6 people could defeat. But defeat was not what I was planning for. The Breton force did not need to be defeated. They needed to be confused, disrupted, delayed until coalition reinforcements could reach us, which, based on my distress signal sent in the first 30 seconds of the attack, would be approximately 6 hours. 6 hours was a long time, but the Breath were going to arrive expecting something specific. They expected a convoy sitting in a canyon with its engines dead, guarded by a handful of soldiers paralyzed by fear, surrounding one very valuable person who could not defend herself. They expected a retrieval operation, simple, clean, the kind of thing they had done dozens of times before. They expected, in other words, rational behavior from a rational opponent. Why I was going to give them was me. I explained the plan to Vale in 8 minutes flat. He listened with his arms folded and his expression doing the careful work of not showing anything. When I finished, there was a pause. You want us to be unpredictable, he said. I want us to be inexplicable, I corrected. There's a difference. He looked at the map again, then he looked at the canyon wall diagram I had sketched on the back of a cargo manifest. Then he looked at Das, who was already pulling equipment from the med pack with the efficient calm of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything years ago. If this works, Vale said slowly, it will be because they cannot model what you're doing. Yes, I said, and if it does not work, then we do the next thing, I said. There's always a next thing. He studied me for a long moment with an expression I could not fully read. Then he straightened up and started issuing quiet orders to the soldiers around him. I went to find the princess. She was in a forward section of Transport 7, sitting on a supply crate with her long coat folded across her knees and the sidearm resting on top of it within easy reach. Orvis was beside her speaking quietly, but she looked up when I came through the door. The main force arrives in approximately 35 minutes, I told her. She nodded. She had already worked that out. I need you to stay in this compartment, I said. I need you to stay low, stay quiet, and if anything comes through that door that Orvis has not confirmed to you in advance, you use that. I nodded at the sidearm. She looked at it, then at me. What are you going to do? Make the canyon a complicated place to walk through, I said. She tilted her head slightly. You're not afraid? I'm terrified, I said, but that's not the part that controls my legs. That seemed to catch her off guard. She was quiet for a moment. What are humans afraid of? She asked. It was a genuine question, not a polite one. She actually wanted to know the same things everyone is afraid of. I said, pain, failure, the people we care about getting hurt. The difference is that fear makes us faster. It does not make most species faster, she said. No, I agreed. Most species evolve in environments where the smart move when something large and dangerous appeared was to go very still and hope it did not notice you. My species evolved on a world that did not really leave that option available. Everything on our planet wanted to eat us, and most of it could outrun us, and almost all of it was stronger. We could not freeze. Freezing was a guaranteed end, so instead we made ourselves in the most awkward, inconvenient, relentless, irritating prey anything had ever encountered. We never stopped. We fell down and got up. We got hurt and kept going. We ran toward things because running away was slower. She was watching me carefully. We are the species, I said, that decided somewhere in our deep past that the correct response to a large, dangerous predator was to follow it for 3 days without sleeping until it was too exhausted to run, and then pick up a rock. Silence. That is a terrible survival strategy, she said. It worked. I said. A faint pause, then very carefully, yes, I suppose it did. I checked the scanner. 28 minutes. I need to go. Calloway, she said. I turned at the door. I understand now why you checked the canyon ridgeline 4 times this morning, she said. I watched you do it from the observation deck window. I had not known she had seen that. I dismissed it, she said. Not quite an apology, just a fact stated honestly. I should not have. No, I said, but that's fine. I'm going to do my job anyway. I left before she could respond. The canyon was quiet when I stepped back out onto the floor of it. The 3 scouts I had taken down earlier were still in the dust. I moved past them and headed for the position I had marked on my mental map, a section of the northern approach where the canyon walls narrowed to about 12 m across, creating a natural choke point before it opened into the wider stretch where the convoy was sitting. 12 m2 walls, good handholds, plenty of shadow. I looked at the walls. I looked at the canyon floor. I started working. The next 25 minutes were some of the busiest of my life. I will not say that what I built was elegant, because it was not. It was entirely improvised, made from broken components pulled off the dead transports, fuel line sections, lengths of wire from the power coupling, arrays, 2 additional flash canisters, and 3 more of the freight boxes. What it lacked in elegance, it made up for in coverage. By the time I was done, the 12M choke point was rigged in 7 separate layers, not to stop 12 WH warriors, nothing I could build with freight boxes and wire was going to stop 12 Wrath warriors, but 12 WH warriors who had just walked through the first layer, then the second, then the third, each one triggering a new surprise in a different direction. Were not going to be thinking in straight lines anymore. Their psionic coordination was powerful, but it processed tactical information sequentially. Each unexpected event needed to be shared, evaluated, and responded to collectively before they moved again. Every second they spent doing that was a second they were not spending on the princess. I climbed to my position above the third layer, a ledge about 4M up the canyon wall with good lines of sight in both directions, and checked the time, 3 minutes. I lay flat on the ledge and put my scanner away. Electronics could be detected. From here on, I was using my eyes. Breatham main force came into the canyon from the north exactly when I expected them, 12 figures moving in the same unhurried, synchronized way the scouts had moved, large, deliberate, radiating the absolute certainty of things that have never been surprised. The commander was easy to identify, positioned at the center of the formation, marginally larger than one all the others were, spacing themselves relative to the psionic link radiated from them like a signal tower. Take out that signal and the formation collapsed from one precise machine into 12 individuals. I had 4 rounds left in my sidearm. I intended to use exactly one of them on the commander, but not yet. Let them come to the first layer first. The lead warrior stepped into choke point and walked directly into the first wire, not a tripping wire. I had not been trying to trip a breath, which would have been pointless, but a current wire live running from the salvage power cell I had wired to the canyon wall. The discharge was enough to interrupt the psionic signal for approximately 2 seconds. 2 seconds of silence in the lake. The formation stuttered just slightly, just for a moment, but the perfect synchronization broke. In those 2 seconds, the second layer activated. The freight boxes I had stacked against the eastern wall, balanced against a wire trigger, collapsed onto the floor of the canyon with a sound that echoed off both walls and hit from every direction simultaneously. In a 12M wide corridor of rock, that sound was enormous. The breath formation reoriented toward the noise because the noise came from the east. That turned them collectively 20 degrees to their right. That was when the flash canister on the western wall fired, not smoke, pure white light triggered by the heat sensor I had placed in the shadow line on the western face in an enclosed canyon with smooth walls. A flash canister does not just affect whoever is looking at it, it bounces 3 surfaces minimum. The whole choke point lit up like the inside of star for about 1.12 seconds. Breath sensory organs are extremely sophisticated. They are not well suited to sudden total light saturation. The formation went from 22 degrees off axis to a full stop. While they were stopped and while the psionic link was working to redistribute the sensory overload across 12 minds simultaneously, I was already off the ledge and moving. I had planned the route to the commander before the Formation entered the canyon. I had walked it twice slowly, eyes closed. Second time, committing every step to memory because I was going to be moving it at speed and poor visibility, and I could not afford a wrong turn. 31 steps from the ledge to the canyon floor. Then left, then the gap between the second and third freight box stacks, then right, coming at the commander from the northwest from the precise angle. Their peripheral sensory organs had the narrowest coverage because I had looked that up too in the biological section of the breath tactical file that most people found too dense to finish reading. I covered the 31 steps in what felt like no time and a very long time. Simultaneously, my left ankle was not happy about it. I kept moving. The commander sensed me at the last possible moment. I saw the head begin to turn, the exoskeletal shoulder begin to rise, the whole massive form starting to react with the terrifying speed that breath combat soldiers possess when they are focused and coordinated and fully operational. They were not fully operational right now. The field restraint charge I pressed against the base of the commander's neck at that moment was a single-use device from the emergency equipment kit designed for use on injured large animals. It was absolutely not rated for use on a breath warrior in combat. The charge delivered a focused electromagnetic pulse to the immediate nerve cluster. The psionic link went silent. 12 minds simultaneously connected were suddenly 11 minds in one silence, and the 11 minds reacted in a way I had not predicted. They stopped moving, all of them at the same instant, not from the dampener. The dampener was not in use anymore. They stopped because the psionic link processed the silence of the commander as a threat category it had never encountered before. And when a coordinated psionic unit encounters threat category it has never encountered before, the protocol is to stop all movement and perform collective tactical assessment. I was already moving backward, getting clear because the next 7 seconds were either going to be the most important of my life or the last. I was not going to spend them standing still. The commander was down, not eliminated, already beginning to recover. The electromagnetic pulse fading, but down for long enough. Psionic link was rebuilding. I could almost feel it, like a sound at the edge of hearing. The 11 minds working to reestablish connection, to account for the absence, to reorganize. It took 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds I was back at the ledge, back in position, watching. The formation started to move again, more slowly than before. The commander was partially recovered, but not yet back to full connection strength. I could tell because the synchronization was not quite perfect. Small egg between the lead warriors and the rear. They moved forward through the choke point, past the collapse boxes, past the first wire, past the spent flash canister. They came into the wider section of the canyon where the convoy was sitting. They stopped, looked at the convoy at the open rear ramp of Transport 7, at the 3 scouts secured in the dust to the canyon floor, at the 1 scout visible just inside the ramp, secured to an interior wall. The commander raised one arm, the communication gesture that Verith used when issuing non-psionic orders to units outside the link's range. Nothing responded because there was no one to respond to it. The scouts were secured. The situation in front of them was not the situation they had come to resolve. The convoy was not helpless. The unit. Defending it was not broken. The prize they had come to retrieve was nowhere visible. The commander held the arm up for 3 more seconds, then lowered it. The 11 combat soldiers stood in the canyon for the next 6 minutes. I counted every second from my ledge position. Flat on my stomach, scanner off. Breathing slow and quiet. During those 6 minutes, I thought about a lot of things. I thought about the fuel line I had left running 2 sections back. I thought about whether Das had been able to reach Vale with the secondary distress relay. I thought about whether my left ankle was going to be permanently damaged or just temporarily. Very angry at me, I thought about the princess behind her cargo frame holding the sidearm in both hands with a muzzle steady. I thought about the thing the lead scout had done back at the beginning when it had walked into the edge of the fuel spill and stopped. I thought about the commander stopping all movement for 11 seconds when the link broke. They could adapt. Of course they could. They were a sophisticated, intelligent species with centuries of tactical development, but they adapted. Through the link, they adapted. Collectively with the full processing power of multiple minds working as one. What they had not developed the way humans had was an individual habit of improvisation, the ability to look at a situation that had gone completely sideways and start building something new from the pieces. That habit in humans had been born from necessity. We had spent 100,000 years on a single, brutal planet where everything tried to end us and nothing gave us a coordinated warning system. We adapted alone or in small groups in the dark with whatever we had in our hands. We had gotten very, very good at it. At the 6-minute mark, the commander turned, gave the arms signal again, and the formation withdrew, not running, not panicking. They moved exactly the way they had arrived, controlled, deliberate, unhurried. But they moved north, back through the choke point, back into the canyon approach, away from the convoy. I lay on my ledge and watched them go until the last figure disappeared into the northern darkness of the canyon pass. Then I lay there for another full minute, staring at the sky, breathing. My left ankle had a lot to say about the events of the past 2 hours. I told it to wait. Then I climbed down slowly and walked back to Transport 7. The rear ramp was open. Vale was standing at the bottom of it, arms folded, watching me come behind him. I could see the other soldiers. Das had a medical kit open. The 2 Sun soldiers were standing with their weapons held loose and their faces doing something complicated. Vale looked at me for a long moment. You did all of this alone, he said. It was not quite the same tone as when he had said it the first time back in the cabin when he was looking at the rig canyon. It was not surprise, it was something else. Something I did not have an exact name for, but that I recognized the shape of. You did most of the waking up, I said. He did not smile. Cathali rarely did. But something in his expression shifted slightly. He stepped back to let me up the ramp. Inside, the princess was standing in the main cabin, not behind the cargo frame anymore, standing up straight with the sidearm held properly at her side and her other hand resting on the frame, watching me come through the door. I stopped, looked at her. She looked at the canyon beyond the ramp, at the empty stretch of rock where 12 breath combat soldiers had stood 6 minutes ago and were nowhere to be found. Then she looked at me. They left, she said. Not a question. They left, I confirmed, because of what you did in the canyon. Partly, I said, partly. Because the situation stopped making sense to them and they needed to reassess. They'll come back eventually with more information and a different approach, but we have time now. Reinforcements will be here in about 5 hours. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. You broke their commanders link, she said. I could feel it from here. There was a moment when the psionic pressure in the air just stopped, like a sound cutting off for about 11 seconds. I said, 11 seconds, she repeated. And in 11 seconds you were back in position, and they never found where you had been. They're very good at looking for rational threat positions. I said, I try not to occupy rational threat positions. Another pause. Calloway, she said, yes, on the landing platform this morning. When I said, she stopped, looked at her hands, looked back at me. I categorized you incorrectly. Lots of people do, I said. That is not an excuse, she said. It is, if anything, evidence that the error is systemic, which means it is more serious, not less. I looked at her for a moment, then I said, right now I need Das to look at my ankle. Can this wait? Something crossed her face that might in another context have been the beginning of a surprised laugh. Yes, she said. It can wait. I found Das by the forward panel and sat down on the cargo frame while she ran her scanner across my foot. Behind me I could hear the princess talking to Orvis again. Quiet, quick, very organized. She was already working on something. Das told me the ankle was not broken, just badly stressed. She wrapped it and told me to stay off it as much as possible for the next 24 hours. I thanked her and asked for a ration bar because I had been running on adrenaline and a half-eaten breakfast for 2 hours, and I was suddenly extremely hungry. Das gave me one and looked at me with the precise expression of someone who has decided they do not have enough context to say anything useful and has chosen silence instead. I ate the ration bar and watched the canyon through the open ramp. Quiet, just rock and dust and the long orange light of Vareth IV sun sliding slowly down the western wall. I pulled out my scanner and checked it once more. No signatures on approach. The breath force was holding position somewhere beyond the northern entrance, waiting, thinking. I knew what they were thinking, in the way that you know what a problem is thinking when you are the one who made it a problem. They were asking themselves, what kind of thing does that? What kind of thing is afraid and keeps moving? What kind of thing takes down scouts with freight boxes and wire, breaks a psionic link with a veterinary charge, and then gets back to position in 11 seconds in the dark? They did not have a category for it. They would build one eventually. They were intelligent, and they would adapt. But right now, in this moment, they were sitting in the northern approach of a canyon on a moon they had expected to walk through without difficulty, and they were reconsidering. In the long history of Wrath Dominion expansion, they had never used the tactical classification for disengage until understood. They used it, apparently, for very few things they could not yet quantify. I filed that away. Then I leaned my head back against the canyon wall and closed my eyes for exactly 3 minutes, because there were 4 more hours until reinforcements arrived, and I wanted to be sharp when I needed to be sharp. And right now, for just these 3 minutes, I could afford a rest. My ankle hurt. My shoulder was bruised from the transport roof jump. I was dirty from the canyon floor. I had 7 things I needed to Brief veil on before the next potential. Contact window. I closed my eyes anyway. The princess was talking behind me. Organizing, preparing. Her voice was steady and clear and doing exactly what needed to be done. I thought I was right. Not to take it personally, then I thought she was right to start paying attention. Then I stopped thinking for 3 minutes and let the silence of the canyon hold me. The coalition reinforcement shuttles arrived 5 hours and 40 minutes after my initial distress signal, coming in from the south with running lights bright and engines at full power, making exactly the kind of dramatic entrance that arrives reliably after the difficult work is already done. I was sitting on the rear ramp of Transport 7 when they landed. My ankle was wrapped. I had a second ration bar. Vale was standing to my right, and Das was finishing her medical notes on the data pad to my left. The 2 Sun soldiers were at the front of the convoy, helping the recovering members of the unit run system diagnostics. 4 breath scouts were secured in a tidy row inside Transport 7's main cabin. The breath main force had not returned. The lead reinforcement shuttle's rear ramp descended with a hydraulic hiss, and out came Colonel Aaron Ferris, a Sun officer senior, decorated, wearing the kind of composed expression that high-ranking officers practice until it becomes involuntary. He was flanked by 8 fully armed soldiers in fresh gear and a coalition intelligence officer with a data recorder already running. Colonel Ferris looked at the convoy. He looked at the canyon. He looked at the 4 secured breath scouts visible through the open ramp of Transport 7. He looked at me. Recruit Calloway, he said. Colonel, I said, where is the princess? Forward. Cabin Transport 7. She is unharmed. He was quiet for a moment, taking in the full picture, the condition of the canyon floor, the rigged sections of the paths behind me still partially intact, the complete absence of the 12 VTH combat soldiers who, according to my distress signal, had entered the canyon over 2 hours ago. Where is the breath main force? He asked. Northern approach. Approximately 4 km. I said. They withdrew about 2 hours ago. No renewed contact since. Another pause. They withdrew, he said. Yes, sir. 12 combat soldiers. Yes, sir. He looked at Vale. Vale looked back at him with a perfectly even expression and said, the recruit's account is accurate, Colonel. Colonel Ferris returned his gaze to me. There was a long moment where he appeared to be reorganizing something significant inside his thinking. Then he said very carefully, walk me through what happened. I walked him through it. I was concise. I covered the timeline, the tactical decisions, the outcomes. I did not editorialize. I gave him facts. When I finished, he was quiet for so long that the intelligence officer beside him stopped recording and looked up from the data device. The restraint charge, the colonel said finally on the psionic. Commander, standard large animal emergency kit, I said, from a med pack. You knew where to apply it. The tactical file on breath biology had the sensory node locations in the appendix, I said. He stared at me. I have read that file 11 times, and I do not remember the appendix. It is quite long, I agreed. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Then he looked at the canyon again, at the rigged choke point at the freight boxes still scattered across the 12M section of the pass. They have never retreated before, he said quietly, almost to himself. Not in any coalition contact record in 30 years. I know. Said I read those too. He turned back to me. You read the 30-year contact records. I had trouble sleeping last night, I said. Colonel Ferris looked at me for a very long time. Then he said in the tone a man who has just revised an entire category of assumption, recruit Calloway. I would like you to come with me inside Transport 7. The princess was waiting. She had known, I suspected, exactly when the shuttles arrived. She had probably been tracking their approach on the ship's secondary sensors, the ones that were still operational. She was standing in the main cabin, her coat back on, every line of her posture composed, the sidearm no longer in her hands, but set neatly on top of the folded cargo manifest on the crate beside her. When Colonel Ferris entered, she gave him the formal greeting of the chorus throne, a measured gesture precise in its hierarchy, and he returned it with equal precision. Then she looked past him at me. Calloway, she said. My lady, said the colonel, and I have considerable matters to discuss, she said. But before that, your name, your full name. Colonel Ferris glanced between us, clearly catching a subtext he did not have the context to interpret. Owen Calloway, I said. She repeated it quietly. Owen Calloway, as though she was making a note of it. That is correct, I said. She nodded once, then she turned to Colonel Ferris and said, shall we begin? The debrief took 4 hours. I was not in the room for most of it. I was outside on the canyon floor helping Vale and the reinforcement soldiers document the rigged positions and collect the equipment for evidence. DOS made me sit down 3 separate times when my ankle gave me trouble. Each time I sat for approximately 40 seconds and then stood up again. You're going to make that worse, DOS said the 3rd time. Probably, I agreed. How long until transport to the medical bay? 2 hours. Then I have 2 hours, I said, and went back to helping. The intelligence officer, whose name was Petra Oakes, found me at the northern end of the choke point while I was photographing the wire arrangement for the evidence log. I have a question, she said. All right, I said. The breath withdrawal, she said. The tactical log from the commander's wrist unit. We downloaded it while you were doing the debrief. It uses a threat classification I have never seen before in 30 years of breath contact files. I waited. It translates roughly as unquantifiable threat. Disengage until understood, she said. They have a protocol for this. It exists in their tactical doctrine, but it has never been activated in any documented engagement until now. I said, until now, she confirmed. She looked at the wire arrangement in front of us, at the freight boxes, at the fuel line residue still faintly visible on the canyon floor. It is not that you defeated them, she said slowly. It is that you did something they could not categorize, and rather than engage in unclassifiable threat without sufficient data, they disengaged. They're intelligent, I said. They'll build a file. They'll adapt. Yes, she said, but they will build a file on you, on what you did, on what a human does when frightened and cornered and entirely outmatched. She was quiet for a moment. What does a human do, she said, when frightened and cornered and entirely outmatched? I looked at the free boxes, at the fuel stain, at the quiet canyon floor. We improvise, I said. We get creative. We use whatever is in our hands, and we keep going until the situation changes. Why? She asked genuinely. I thought about it honestly, because giving up feels worse. I said, even when the math does not. Support continuing, even when the rational analysis says stop. There is something in us that finds stopping in the middle worse than any other outcome. We would rather fail moving than succeed. At standing still, Petra Oakes recorded. That she had the recorder running and I had not noticed. I looked at it. You did not ask before you recorded that. I said no, she said without apology. I did not. She paused the recorder. That quote is going into the official file. Recruit Calloway, the one that will be distributed to every coalition tactical intelligence unit in this sector. She looked at me steadily. Humanity has been categorized for a century as a minor contributing species. I think that file is about to be significantly revised. I did not say anything to that. I looked at the canyon, at the sky above it, which was beginning to darken into the deep orange of Verith IV's evening, at the transport ships beginning their engine warm-up cycles 200 m behind me. It was one engagement. I said finally. Yes, she said, the Breath Dominion has its first entry in a brand new file, and so does the coalition. She put the recorder away. One engagement is how all files begin. She walked back toward the transports. I stood in the choke point for a while longer. The canyon was quiet. Now just the rock in the dust and the fading light. The last place 12 Reth combat soldiers had stood before they decided they needed more information. Before they came back, unquantifiable threat. I thought about that, about what it meant in a tactical doctrine built on the absolute certainty of superiority, about what it meant when the universe's apex predators looked at something and said, we do not have a box for this. Yet, then I thought about the 100,000 years of human history that had built that moment, every hard season, every near extinction, every time the species had looked at an impossible situation and decided somehow inexplicably to stay and solve it rather than accept the ending. Every human who had ever said in the dark with nothing in their hands. Not yet. It was a long inheritance. I picked up my scanner, made one last note in the evidence log, and walked back to the transports. Vale fell in his step beside me. Medical bay, he said. It was not a suggestion. Medical bay, I agreed. We walked in silence for a moment. Then Vale said very quietly, I have fought in 3 major engagements. I have trained soldiers for 11 years. A pause. I have never in any of those years seen what I saw today. I glanced at him. I do not know if it was courage or something stranger than courage, he said, but I think the galaxy is going to need to find a new word for it. I thought about that for a few steps. We have one, I said. We just call it stubbornness. Vale made a sound that for a Cathali passed as a laugh. We reached transport 7. Ramp was down, the lights on, the reinforcement soldiers moving through it in an efficient stream. Somewhere inside, the princess was completing her debrief with Colonel Ferris, and Petra Oakes was building a file that was going to travel through coalition intelligence networks at the speed of a signal burst. I stepped onto the ramp and stopped, looked back at the canyon one more time. The northern approach was empty and quiet. Somewhere up there, 4 km away, the Breath Command Unit was composing a report, was assigning a category, was writing in the precise tactical language of a 300-year military tradition, the first entry in a file on humanity that had not existed before today. Unquantifiable threat. I had done nothing superhuman. I had read the files. that other people found too long. I had checked the RGEL line because something felt wrong. I had moved when others were frozen, not because I was brave, but because stopping was simply not something I was built to do. In that moment, I had used the freight boxes and the wire and the veterinary charge and the geometry of a canyon on a moon I had never visited before, and I had made it enough, just enough. That was the thing about stubbornness. It did not need to be elegant. It did not need to be impressive. It just needed to be enough for long enough until the situation changed. The situation had changed. I went up the ramp. The medical bay was small and slightly too warm and smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. Das unwrapped my ankle, looked at it with the expression of a professional who has been proven right, and rewrapped it with more support than before. Off it for 24 hours, she said. I heard you the first time. I said, you ignore me the first time. She said, true. I said. She finished a wrap and made a note on her data pad. Then she paused. The princess asked me how you were, she said without looking up. I said nothing. She was specific about it. Das added, not how are the wounded, not how is the unit. She asked about you by name. A pause. By your actual name, not your designation. I looked at the ceiling of the medical bay. She was just checking. I said, yes, said Das. That is what I told her. She closed her data pad. I told her you were annoying and functional. Good. I said, that's accurate. Das left. I lay back on the narrow medical bay cot and stared at the ceiling. Outside, I could hear the convoy beginning to reassemble, engines coming online, the sound of the reinforcement soldiers moving through their departure checks, the quiet, competent noise of a situation being resolved. I thought about the princess asking for my name, really asking in a way that means you intend to use it and remember it, not as a title, not as a designation, just a name. Owen Calloway, a recruit, 26 years old, from a rainy town on a planet that the galaxy had mostly noticed because we were interesting and occasionally useful. A recruit who was now apparently an entry in a breath tactical file under a category that had never been activated before. I thought about that for a while, about what it meant that the universe's most feared military force had looked at one human with his freight boxes and his wire and his veterinary charge and said, we need more information before we understand this. It was not a victory in the traditional sense. We had not defeated them. We had not driven them back. We had simply made the canyon too confusing to proceed through, and they had decided rationally that confused was a dangerous state to operate in. But I kept coming back to the same thought. They had come, and assuming certainty, they had left carrying a question. That was enough. That was maybe the most important thing a human had ever managed in this sector of the galaxy. Not strength, not power, just a question they did not have an answer to. We would give them more questions eventually. That was the thing about humans. We had a talent for showing up in places and making them complicated. The convoy started moving. I closed my eyes and let the gentle motion of the transport carry me, and I thought about nothing much at all for the first time in several hours, and it was very peaceful, and I was extremely grateful for it. Somewhere ahead of me, the princess was in the forward cabin, and the colonel was writing his report, and Petra Oakes was building her file, and somewhere behind me, 4 km north, a breath command unit was writing down a word. It Had never used before. I thought that was a fine place for things to stand. I fell asleep before the canyon mouth had fully disappeared behind us, and I did not dream. And when I woke, the stars were out and Vareth 4 was a shrinking orange light in the rear viewport. I was still a recruit. I was still one human in a galaxy full of species that had been counting longer than we had, but I was in the file now, and in the file my name was not primate, it was unquantifiable. I can work with that.